Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Hello and welcome to Brave New World. Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. My guest today is Aswath Damodaran. Aswath is the world's guru on valuation, and today's session is about investing. Investing is hard, which is why I tend to favor algorithms which are simple and consistent over humans who tend to be complex and inconsistent. But there are notable exceptions, like Warren Buffett, Stanley Druckenmiller, Seth Klarman, and Aswath Damodaran. And what's particularly notable about Aswath is that he keeps score. His predictions are all out there on the internet going back decades. And when you keep score, the market invariably humbles you, but you have a chance to get better. Aswath is brilliant at what he does, and because he keeps score, he remains humble and keeps getting better. Talking to him is always a learning experience and a lot of fun. Aswath, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
I'm glad to be on.
You're Mr. Valuation and, you're a public figure, but tell us a little bit about your early life that started this journey that you've been on for quite some time now.
My early life, as in how I ended up in valuation, is
Yeah. We'll segue into that, but go back before that.
I started my life like everybody else, not knowing what I wanted to do. Went off to college, wanted to be in business. Decided to get my MBA I got my PGDM from IIM Bangalore in the early days of the IIMs, when the IIM Bangalore was actually it was actually the business school in India designed to turn out graduates for public sector enterprises. Shows you how long ago that was. Now, there was actually a hope that public sector enterprises would have professional managers and you could train them. That was 1979. Then I went on to UCLA to get an MBA, again expecting to go work for an investment bank or do something lucrative. And then in my final semester of my MBA program, I ended up being a TA for a class. It wasn't even a class I enjoyed that much. It was accounting. I walked in front of the classroom, and I still tell people 15 minutes in, I knew this was what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I wanted to be a teacher. And that's how I describe myself still. I'm not in valuation or corporate finance. I'm a teacher who happens to teach valuation or corporate finance. But teaching is my passion. So that laid out. So the rest of my pathway was defined by those 15 minutes as a TA saying, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. Went on to get my PhD at UCLA and then started teaching.
So that was it, the 15 minutes with a bunch of numbers in an accounting class, and you figured this kind of smells right. I want to be...
I tell people everybody has this moment of grace where they get to see what they were meant to do. Most of us are too busy to observe those moments. I just got lucky that I was aware enough of how much I was enjoying the process that I had to stop and ask, is this what I want to do with the rest of my life? So there's nothing special about me. Everybody has their moments of grace. Most of us either bulldoze it and keep doing what we were meant to do or wanted to do. I just happened to be listening.
It's funny how this happens, right? This happened to me. I saw my first experience with a physician talking to an intelligent medical diagnostic system discussing a case. And I said, wow, this is so cool. I mean, it's like, it just spoke to me.
Yeah.
And the rest is history. I sort of got into AI, I guess, way too early, but it just spoke to me. So, Aswath, I've always sort of known you as a numbers guy. You're Mr. Valuation. It's all about numbers. When did you sort of go over to this dark side of stories and narratives?
It's actually interesting. Often we think of other people based on what they teach or what they work in, right? For instance, if you know somebody's a banker, even if you know nothing about them, you assume that they must work with numbers. If they're in corporate finance, if you're, on the other hand, if you're a historian, I assume you're a storyteller, that you don't care about numbers. But that's just the stereotyping that comes from believing something about a discipline. I mean, let's face it, when in valuation, most people assume that you must work with numbers, that this is all valuation is about, because that's what most of us, when we think about valuation, think about Excel spreadsheets and numbers going into spreadsheets. I've always been a story person and a numbers person. I mean, my numbers side is my strongest side, but my story side has always been there. And early on, when I taught valuation, I would suppress the story side because I thought it was a sign of weakness to talk about stories. It was all about the numbers. Now, I tell people, when in doubt, you put up an equation. If you're still doubtful, put up a second equation. If you're still doubtful as a numbers person, you make them simultaneous equations. And then you feel much better because you feel like you've done something. And initially, when I taught valuation, I tried to keep it on the numbers. And about 6 years into teaching this class, 1992 or 93, I knew I had a problem. And here was my problem. I could value just about anything, but I had no faith. Strange word to use in the context of valuation. But if you think about it, no, valuation is the most pragmatic of all exercises. You don't value companies because you're intellectually curious. You value companies because you want to act on your valuations. And I found myself unable to pull the trigger. In other words, when I found something undervalued, I wasn't willing to say buy because I knew how much I could move the numbers and the values. Very much just a numbers exercise. It's the time I woke up to the realization that without a story, you don't have a valuation, you just have a spreadsheet, a financial model. Stories are what keep numbers together, that keep you consistent, that keep you from essentially making up stuff as you go. So I would love to say I knew this right from the beginning, but it took me a while to get there. And early on, it was difficult. The first time I did it was like pulling teeth. I wanted to go back to my numbers side. But I've become better at it over time. I'm still naturally a numbers person, but I've become much better at telling stories. And I think it's made me better on both my numbers side and as a valuation person.
Aswath, it's funny you say this because we've had some common students over the years, and I sometimes refer to your class and say, as you might have learned, through the templates that Aswath gives you, and et cetera, very often, I've gotten back a response like, yeah, but he tells great stories. So, and I think you noted that in your book as well. People remember stories.
But for a long time, before we had books, that's how we passed down knowledge, right? We told stories that were told to our children, who told them to us. So this is older than books have been around. I mean, without telling stories, I don't think human beings would have survived on the face of the earth. I mean, that's how memories have been carried down. We can't wipe out evolution just because we have more numbers, or Excel came into being in 1986. So sometimes people are trying to kind of reinvent how human beings think. And I tell people, no matter, even if you have numbers people, they will remember the stories you tell a lot more vividly than any number that you talk about in the context of describing a business or talking about a process.
So let's segue to the book itself, right? So summarize this integration of fusion of numbers and narrative, because you do caution people that, you caution the reader that, there's Theranos, there's Bernie Madoff, there's no dearth of stories that sounded really good. I mean, Madoff's story was amazing, right? It had sort of some intrigue. It had a little bit of complication, like, he's using options a lot of people don't understand. There was some plausibility, and it was a good story. The Theranos story, likewise, people really wanted to believe it. Amazing story, driven individual, all of that, right? And that's my fear with stories. Am I falling prey to a really good story, right? And you start the book by sort of cautioning against this.
The storytelling is now in Silicon Valley part of what venture capitalists do, right? In fact, there are storytelling classes for founders. So you're saying this is good storytelling. You say the problem I have with Silicon Valley storytelling is it's storytelling without any checks, no balances. It's really storytelling where without connecting to the numbers, you're going to be telling fairy tales. So you're absolutely right. Stories by themselves are just as dangerous as numbers by themselves. Numbers people have no imagination. There's nothing holding the numbers together. Story people without numbers can tell fairy tales. So when they make claims and the claims are huge, if there's no number in the process, what's to stop you from essentially making your story so big that I pay a huge price for something not worth very much? So the way to read my book is it's not a plea for more storytelling or a plea for more number crunching. It's a plea for doing both. So if you're a storyteller, I'm saying bring some numbers into your story. Make your story grounded in reality. If you're a number cruncher, it's saying have a story, hold your numbers together. Because each side left to its own devices is essentially going to give you strange results or strange looking outcomes because there's no check or balance on what you're doing.
How do you actually do that? So let's dig in a little bit deeper. And you've actually borrowed from people. I don't remember the name. I think Freitag was one.
Yeah.
Campbell, and you talk about that there are 7 themes: overcoming the monster, rebirth, quest, rags to riches, voyages and return, comedy, tragedy. And similarly, you have these story types, which is bully, underdog, etc. Right? So give us a little bit of a more flesh around this. Maybe use an example.
Let's take Uber, right? Uber, when it started, had very simple rule, Travis Kalanick, which is don't ask for permission, do something and ask for permission later. So you're telling a story, it's a story of an outlaw who's got basically a Robin Hood complex. So if you are a person using Uber and you are paying half what you paid on a taxi, you felt that this was a company that was breaking the rules to benefit you. Of course, what you were ignoring was the way this structure was built was on the backs of people who were underestimating the value of their own time. Drivers who were really making $6 an hour when they might think they're making 16, but but I think if you take Uber, it built itself up as an outlaw company. And it was what allowed it to grow as fast as it did. But at some point in time, that story came back to bite them. Like every story, there's a dark side to the story. The dark side to the outlaw story is you are, in fact, violating rules and regulations to get where you are. And at some point in time, those violations are going to create costs which are large enough for other people that they're going to push back. So with Uber, the story initially was we're an outlaw company. We're essentially going to go after the status quo. We're going to take them to the cleaners. And early on, it worked to their benefit. People thought this is a company I want to invest in because I don't like the taxi cab business. But once Uber became the dominant player, the taxi cabs were now a minor competition. You're now the big company in town. You're no longer the outlaw. You're running the system. It requires a very different set of skills to run the company. There's a reason Travis had to leave the company. The company had reached a point where they couldn't go any further with him at the top and as an outlaw. You needed to bring somebody in who was more of a status quo person, somebody who came from the system, who would actually find a way for Uber now to become part of the system. I mean, I'm glad they didn't go with Jeff Immelt, which would have been a terrible choice as a CEO for Uber. But Dara Khosrowsky, in a sense, was somebody who came from within the system, not an outlaw. You can see Uber trying to remake itself as a company. So early on when you value Uber, it's about being an outlaw company with all the pluses and minuses of being an outlaw company. You can go after any market, but your costs are going to come from lawsuits and regulations directed at you. Now, with Uber, now you're facing much more of a traditional ride-sharing company. We're asking more conventional questions about, hey, now that you're the dominant ride-sharing company, how do you convert all these riders into profits? So the kinds of story you tell and it also suggests that the person, I mean, often I've heard this discussion of what's the right CEO for a company. I don't see how people can even answer the question without knowing what the company is. Early on, Travis was the perfect CEO for Uber. He thought outside the box. He didn't like the rules. He broke the rules. Today, I think you need a very different CEO. You need somebody who can build a business. They've got 95 million, 100 million riders. They've got the rider number nailed down. They now have to figure out a way to make the business more sticky. So I think the story for Uber has changed. The type of CEO you want for Uber has changed. The valuation has to reflect that.
So what you're also saying suggests that you have to be on your toes to constantly question whether your narrative is correct and is current, and be willing to change it.
Absolutely.
And it seems to be that that's not easy, right? That's got to be extremely difficult because once we latch onto something, we stay with it.
It's human nature, right? Inertia. And the more successful you've been with a story in the past, the more difficult it becomes to let go. There's a reason. I mean, remember the Clayton Christensen argument of disruption not coming from the companies already in the space. There's lots of reasons for that. One reason for that is disruption requires that you reframe your story. For Tesla, it's no problem. You had no story before. You can say, my new story. But if you're Ford or GM and you're carrying a century of legacy and big successes, it's much more difficult for you to it's not just entering a new business, it's reframing your story. And sometimes people don't believe your story because of who you are. I mean, there's a reason I think the traditional fossil fuel companies are going to have real difficulty becoming successful in green energy. Their names are going to get in the way. Their history is going to get in the way. If you're ExxonMobil, you can tell me, until you're blue in the face that you want to be a green energy company. But I'm going to have a tough time believing that you can make that transition because your history, your success is rooted so much in getting oil out of the ground and being very good at it. So I think that you're right. Changing your story is difficult and gets even more so the longer your history and the more glorious your history.
So, I want to talk to you about things that are really hot these days, like crypto and metaverse and all that stuff. But before we go there, I want to go back a little bit to sort of Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. I was actually looking at one of our past exchanges, which is now almost 10 years old, where, you'd gone on, I don't know, maybe you own CNBC, and you said, I would buy Facebook at $18 a share. And, I remember sending you an email saying, hey, did you buy Facebook? And you said, well, what's the point of doing valuation if you don't act on it? One of the things, sort of interesting things about you is that you keep score.
And I let other people keep score on me because it keeps me honest. Especially in academia, we have this bad habit of saying things and then acting like we never said them.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't do that anymore because I put down on paper what I say and people come back and say, hey, 3 years ago you said this.
Indeed.
So I do it because part of being good at storytelling is to keep the feedback loop open. What I mean by that is you tell a story. For the moment, you might believe that this is the right story, but the world is changing around you and your story has to adapt, change, reflect it. So if you told me a story about a cruise line company in 2019, I would hope that after COVID hit, you'd come back to me with a different story. I think that, telling a story is important, but being willing to revisit a story and say, you know what, I was wrong. I was wrong on that part of the story. And in my book, The Narrative and Numbers, I talk about an exchange I had with Bill Gurley about Uber, where I initially valued it as an urban car service company. And right after I posted it, Bill, those of you not familiar with Bill, partner at Benchmark Capital, one of the first VCs to invest in Uber when they were $1 billion company, took issue with me. He said, you know what, they're not a car service company, they're a logistics company. Words have big consequences in stories. Mm-hmm. By using the word logistics, he was expanding his business from car service to moving to delivery. He said, we're not just urban, we're going to be everywhere. We don't have just local networking benefits. We're going to figure out a way to take our success in big cities and make it global. And he thought I was going to be pissed off because he said some mean things about me because he posted this on his blog. But I was fascinated. In fact, right after I read it, I emailed Bill and said, you've told a really big story about Uber, very different from my story. Would you like me to put a number on your story? And he said, be my guest. So I took my spreadsheet and I changed my total market size and changed my market share because every part of that story has an effect. And I came up with a value that was 4 times higher than my value. And I remember when I posted, people said, well, how can the same company be worth it was 6 billion and 60 billion? It was actually 10 times larger. And I said, depends on how you frame the story. And I think in my original story, my vision was too cramped on Uber because I was thinking about car service as it existed. What I was not factoring in, what Bill pointed out very correctly, was that ride sharing would actually change the car service business, that there'd be people who would use car service who would never have used it before. And you know what? He was absolutely right.
Yeah, interesting. And by the way, is this a similar sort of phenomenon that keeps happening with Tesla? We try and wonder whether Tesla is an energy company or,
I think ultimately Tesla is an automobile company. I think, in spite of their battery business and their solar power business, they're ultimately, what Tesla's done is it's rewritten the rules for the automobile business, right? I mean, I tell people, look, we celebrate these people who show up in Glasgow and Paris for these climate change conferences. I said, I credit them for doing all of that. But one man has done more for climate change than all of these climate change specialists have done in their lifetime. And that one man is Elon Musk. When he came on, if you said electric car at a traditional automobile company, you'd be laughed out of the room. It was a niche product. And essentially, he's effectively changed the narrative for the entire industry. Everybody wants to be in the electric car business now. And Tesla, in a sense, has created, just like Steve Jobs said, I'm not going after some existing device business. I want to change the way people use their phones. I think Elon Musk, in the same way, has changed the way we think about automobiles. That Tesla is not just another car. It's a different way of thinking about transportation. And I think for that, and the story I've told about Tesla has kind of expanded each time I value Tesla. I've kind of hit a ceiling around 2019 or 20 where I've kind of hit the cap. But I can see why the Tesla story has expanded over time, because it started off as a luxury automobile company. I mean, who wants to pay $80,000 for an electric car where you might not be able to find a charger within 300 miles of you unless you live in LA, because that's where they were in 2013. That story has been changed completely, right? So sometimes a company can change the contours of a story by kind of reframing the entire story. Those are, of course, are great companies. And I put Tesla in that group of, Amazon is the same way, right? It's a company that reinvented a business and essentially reframed the story based upon how it was reading the business. And everybody else then had to play based on how they told the story.
Talking about these great companies that have emerged in the last 10 or 15 years and sort of changed the shape of the business landscape, did you underestimate how large these guys would get? And I'll go back to Facebook, and where you bought at 18, and I remember a year later I said, hey, Aswath, great call, and it was 60 or 70, and you say, I sold it at 45 because that was my sort of valuation, and such is life.
And I think if you do intrinsic valuation right, I tell people on the biggest winners, you're going to sell too soon. The nature of intrinsic valuation is your biggest winners you're going to tell, because if you can get the biggest winners right with your valuation, you have a serious problem, because that means you're overvaluing everything. Mm-hmm. If you do fair valuations of companies, your biggest winners, in a sense, have to be outliers. They have to beat your best valuation, because that's the way your mistake. So you're going to make mistakes in both directions. On the biggest winners, you're going to sell too early. On the biggest loser. I mean, so that's what you should expect to see. So when somebody says, I got Amazon right in 2000, Amazon right, as in what they're going to do through 2022. I would love to see what the rest of their portfolio looks like. Because if you got Amazon right because you had that big a number, you probably had 19 other companies you jumped into where you wiped out your entire investment because you overshot the mark. So I tell people, look, I expect to be wrong on the biggest winners because they're the biggest winners for a reason. They won not just because I underestimated the cash flows. It's because they were in the right place at the right time. Luck played a role. They kind of shot through the roof. And I shouldn't expect to get the biggest winners right. So I never walk into this process saying I'm going to get the biggest winner for the next decade. I'd settle for the 20th best winner and kind of getting out too early. Because greed has killed more good investing strategies than any other quality. And I see people getting greedy with big winners. And let's face it, as human beings, we can rationalize just about anything. So once I start abandoning a core investment philosophy, and my core philosophy has to be built upon the presumption that I value companies, I make the best attempt I can to value the companies based on what I know. I buy the companies, and by the same token, I have to leave when the price gets too high. And the minute I abandon that, even on a single company, I run the risk of not having a core philosophy, which means I'm chasing price like a lot. I mean, and there are people who are good at doing it. I'm not good at doing that. So yesterday I valued the FANG-AM stocks. Again, I do it about once a year because they're fascinating stories, right? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, and Apple. I love valuing them because these are big stories, and the most undervalued of the 6 yesterday. Because Facebook, I bought back again after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. It dropped to like 120, and I found a lot of hypocrisy in the way people were piling on. They were complaining about how Microsoft was using all this data that was private, and they were complaining about how it was invading privacy. But all of them were posting on Facebook. I'm sorry, not Microsoft, Facebook. But all of them were posting on Facebook on how Facebook was invading their privacy. And I said, this is hypocrisy. You're getting there, dumping out your private selves there, and then complaining about how Facebook is invading privacy. So I bought Facebook. Then I sold it the day after they changed their name. And it was just instinctive to me because in my experience, companies don't change. There's no real good reason for changing your name, right? Yeah. I mean, as a human being, you change your name to go into the witness protection program, or you change your name because your name's become too toxic. So when they changed their name to Meta, I said, you know what, I'm leaving. But yesterday when I valued the FANG-AM stocks, the cheapest of my 6 is now Facebook.
Interesting. So, I was going to ask you, what you thought of the conduct of these companies. So, but this is obviously like a name change that they're sort of getting bad press.
It's worse than that, right? It must mean that your name has become so toxic that you don't want it associated with you when you do transactions. It might be too late because, let's face it, Philip Morris changed its name to Altria. But when you change your name from Philip Morris to Altria, I don't suddenly forget the fact that you made cigarettes and that there's all these cancer cases that I have to worry about. You're still Altria. So name changes seldom take away the toxicity, but the fact that they changed their name to Meta troubled me even more. Because, at least change your name. And that was my point yesterday with Facebook, is they're cheap, but their story has become muddled. One of the things that always drew me to Facebook is a very simple story. It's a company that invades, I won't say invades is a bad word, that essentially uses private data to deliver focused advertising. That's basically the core story, right? The social media platform is essentially, that's been the core story. Now this Meta thing throws me for a loop. What exactly does that mean? Where is the story going? That is the thing that would trouble me most about investing in Facebook, even though it looks cheap, is I don't know what the story is. And I have a strange feeling that Facebook itself is kind of feeling its way towards a new story. And that's not a good place for any company to be, because if you don't know your story in markets, you know what happens? Markets fill in a vacuum. They make up a story for you. And that story might not be a story you like, but because you left that space unguarded, that's a danger you run when your story is not being told by you. And Facebook, for the moment, has left a vacuum as to what the story is, because it's almost like they're ashamed of calling themselves a social media platform that does advertising. Okay, but what are you then? Because you still make a lot of money. You still make it through advertising, but you're too ashamed to admit that that's how you make money. I'm not sure what your story is. And that's troublesome when that happens at a company.
So Aswath, talking about vacuums and spaces, I feel compelled to ask you this, but the world of investing is just really hard, right? I mean, Yogi Berra said it well. It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And those of us who try it are always getting bruised and getting things wrong a lot. There are numbers people who run simple models, and that's what they do. And I view machine models as being so simplistic. They have to be. And then you have humans that are really complicated and complex. And most of the time, they can't get things right. And I've got a generally dim view of humans as investors, but there are exceptions. I always talk about Warren Buffett or Stanley Druckenmiller or, Seth Klarman. And I include you. And I say, no, I'd give my money to Aswath. I trust him with money. So because you've got this niche of the stories and the numbers, how come you haven't started a Damodaran fund?
Two reasons. One is I think ultimately, and this is the philosophical view of mine, I think investors need to take ownership of their investment decisions. I think for too long, we've trusted our money to other people. We say, you make the decisions for us. I tell people, the right investment philosophy is the one that's right for you. Right? There's a reason. I mean, look at the last 60 years. There's no person who's had more books written about him than Warren Buffett, right? You walk in any bookstore, you essentially can see exactly what he did. And then you ask a follow-up question. If there are so many books about Warren Buffett, how come there aren't more people who make money like Warren Buffett? Which was one of the questions that led me to one of my books, Investment Philosophies, and a course that I teach based on that, where I say, look, there are probably 25, 30, 35 legendary investors. Legendary in the sense, not only have they been successful, they were successful consistently for a long period. But they're very different, right? Peter Lynch was a great investor, but very different from Warren Buffett. So I started thinking, what do they bring to the table? It can't be one philosophy because they have different philosophies. And two things came to mind. One is that each of them had an investment philosophy that they truly believed in. Whatever you think about Warren Buffett, you know exactly where he's coming from. It's a way of thinking about markets. It's not buying low PE stocks that makes him special. It's thinking about markets, which means that whenever a strategy runs out of steam, he can go back to the well of his philosophy and come up with a new strategy built on the same philosophy. It's a core beliefs. Most portfolio managers have no core beliefs. They're reactive. They think about what worked last year and try to do the same thing. So they have and the second is the philosophy was something that fit their personalities. I tell people, look, if you're naturally impatient and you're naturally susceptible to peer pressure, don't be a contrarian value investor. You could read about the research that says it's a way of making money, but if you bend to peer pressure as a contrarian value investor, you're going to feel that peer pressure. Everybody else is going in the opposite direction as you, and it's going to make you uncomfortable. And when things make you uncomfortable because they don't fit your personality, guess what? You're going to abandon those philosophies before they even get a chance to work. So many people read that book by Warren Buffett and say, I'm going to be just like him. And then they do all the research. Let's say they do the research. They find this deeply undervalued company. They buy the stock. And then 3 months later, the stock has gone in the wrong direction. Now they know the book, it says, hang in there. But if you're naturally impatient, there is no way you're going to hold on for the long term. So I tell people the person you best have to understand to be a good investor, forget about great investor, is you. Now, think about what makes you tick. Think about what makes you uncomfortable. Think of what makes you uncomfortable. So essentially build in a way of investing that you're comfortable with. In fact, I have a very simple test with investing. It's called the sleep test, which is if at night you lie awake wondering how your portfolio is doing or what happened that day in the market, you just failed the sleep test.
But Aswath, you've got a philosophy that obviously sort of runs through your books. And when I look at your musings on markets, there are a gazillion views. So obviously people buy into your thinking. And I do as well. So why wouldn't you allow these people to sort of go along for the ride with you? And by the way, there's an associate question there. And I'm assuming that your track record with your own personal investments is pretty darn good.
At least for my kid, I manage my kids' money and my own money. I've done reasonably well. I couldn't tell you whether it was because of luck. That's one of the things, luck versus skill.
Yes,
in fact, there's this great book by Mike Mabusson. I don't know whether you've seen it.
I have. In fact, Mike's had he talks about sports.
Yeah, he talks about sports, right? And essentially shows how difficult it is to separate luck from skill. So for whether I'm lucky or skillful, I've been more lucky than skillful. But I tell people, look, I'd rather open a window to how I value companies and how I buy them. In fact, if you followed my blog, you can essentially invest exactly the way I invest, because almost every stock I've bought in the last 12 years, I've written about the stock. I've written about how I value the stock and why I bought it. And every stock I've sold in the last 12 years, I've told this is why I'm selling. And sometimes I say, look, it's because I'm just not feeling comfortable. Mr. Market has knocked on my door enough on this stock that I'm not comfortable holding on. So I think that rather than manage people's money, I'd like them to say, look, I can do this. And I want them to get to a point where they disagree with me. Because I don't have the story for Facebook. I have my story for Facebook. It drives my decisions, and I want people to be comfortable enough that they can tell their stories. And I'll develop I'll do the mechanics for you. You don't have to be a valuation specialist. You just do the story, and I will give you the mechanism for converting a story. So when I did my Tesla valuation in November of 2021, I said, Tesla is one of those companies where I can value a company, and you're going to disagree with me even before you look at the valuation because you have a point of view. Tesla is one of the companies you either love the company or hate the company. Nothing I do. So rather than me do the valuation, let's make it a do-it-yourself valuation where at each stage I'll tell you what I picked and I'll give you a choice. My spreadsheet is actually built around you making your choices on what you think is a better story.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the process, I'll actually do the mechanics and say, given the story you just told for Tesla, that's your value. And maybe your value would be my value was, I think, 550 billion. And at that time, Tesla was trading at 1.25 trillion. I said, based on my story, I wouldn't buy Tesla, but maybe you have a better story, a different story for Tesla that would lead you to buy. And I think to me, it's a healthier way, because I think we've outsourced too much of our thinking to investment managers that we think are special. And I think it's better to claim ownership of that and make decisions that are, in fact, your decisions.
So to what extent are you an algorithm versus an entity that exercises judgment and looks for exceptions and things like that, right? Because as you've said, you lay out your logic, you've got a certain philosophy, you look at all of the factors that you should look at, you assess risk.
And then I've got to make judgments, right? Every single part of the story is a judgment.
Right, and then you can make 4 or 5 judgments, right?
And let's face it, on each of those variables, there are people who know more than me, right? I'm not an electric car expert. I couldn't. So when I make a judgment, if you're an electric car, so let's say you work in this space, you might look at my judgment and say, that's stupid. You're missing this, this, and this. Hey? Sometimes people email me about their disagreements on an aspect, and I call that my feedback loop opening, where I say, okay, you know what, you're right. When I first valued Tesla, I gave it margins closer to that of the margins of automobile companies, because I am not familiar enough with the engineering happening on the factory floor of an electric car company to know different. And so somebody actually works in an electric car company, and I won't reveal the name, just sent me what the production costs are for an electric car, where the costs come from, and how it's different from a traditional car, and how the gross margins, therefore, can lead to a very different margin business. I didn't know that till somebody who knew more about that from inside the process could explain it to me. So I think so I can provide the valuation structure. That's an algorithm, but the
process.
The process.
You provide the process, the template, and the experts sort of plug in.
Or multiple experts plug in, right? And basically, because nobody is an expert in every aspect of it, which means that there might be room here for crowd. I mean, we've turned everything else over to the crowds, right? We've turned our restaurant reviews to Yelp, our movie choices to Rotten Tomatoes. We still haven't exploited the crowd appropriately when it comes to valuation.
So here's an interesting question, and this relates to a conversation I had last week with Phil Tetlock, who's written a wonderful book called Super Forecasting, which I kept misnomering as Super Forecasters. And when I read the way you value companies, and I put it in the context of my conversation with Phil, I realized that you're kind of one of those super forecasters in a domain, right? I think you're being a little bit modest. But here's why, right? So let me back up a little bit. One of the interesting questions is what makes these super forecasters so good? Why do they stand out from the rest? And the other thing, by the way, that I was surprised by is when you put these super forecasters into a team, they get even better, right? And one of the things about these super forecasters is that they're sort of open-minded. They often question why they got something right when they got it right. And they sometimes say, well, I just got lucky. Might have gotten something right. They pay attention to what he calls the outside story before the inside story. And this reminds me when I was reading your valuation of Zomato and what should that value be, I was intrigued by the questions that you asked, that you actually compared the food takeout industry in China and the US and India, and you put a story together that made comparisons just so that one could get in the right ballpark without knowing anything about Zomato or its 420-page prospectus, right? Just like, how big is this industry in places that we know, where the disposable incomes, the GDPs, unknown. If Phil asked one of these super forecasters to value Zomato, I can't but help think that they would first take the outside view, which is, forget about the specifics of the company, but just sort of look at the macro factors that are sort of the major drivers before getting into, okay, the company and its cash flows and how fast it's been going and so forth, so on and so forth. And I felt exactly the same way, that somehow in finance, we haven't actually managed to exploit this power that can come from a framework such as yours, or a process that says, here's a way to do valuation that makes sense. The question is, can we now get thoughtful people together to answer these questions and plug in the numbers and come up with a valuation of the company?
And sometimes, you're absolutely right. And sometimes you learn things from people. I learned more about Uber by talking to Uber drivers than I did from talking to anybody at Uber. I learned how much friction there was in its basic business model because these Uber drivers in LA and San Diego and New York told me about their interaction with the company. I mean, this is something when they were at their peak and they were raising money, they were claiming to keep 20% of your fare as their revenue. I remember an Uber driver in LA telling me that's what they're telling investors. But I know in LA, they're not keeping more than 7 or 8% because these guys paid me $4,000 to switch from Lyft to drive for them. I'm thinking of switching back because Lyft is offering me $5,000. This is like being a free agent without a contract. And if you're a free agent without a contract, you're essentially going to play this game. So, and to me, the day I knew I'd significantly underestimated Uber's reach was initially when I valued Uber, I assumed that their primary market would be young people. People like my son and my niece who lived on their smartphones. And I knew I'd made a serious mistake about Uber's reach when I went back to India in like 2014. And I went home to Chennai. My mother lives, and she's a conservative South Indian woman. And for those people who know India, this is about so you're several centuries back in the way you do things. And we're going to go out somewhere. And in India, the way car service worked was you open the window, you yell out of the window if you're well-to-do, driver, bring out the car, right? And so that's what I expected her to do. And so we'll get ready to go out. And I noticed that she's got a phone out. First, it's a smartphone. I'm impressed. And she's hitting buttons. And I said, Mom, what are you doing? And she said, I'm calling an Uber. I said, you use Uber? And she said, yeah, I use it all the time. I knew at that moment I dramatically underestimated the reach and the change that ride sharing was creating around the world. So sometimes it's small things that you see and say, you know what, maybe I've got this story wrong. And when I said I'm a dabbler, I don't mean that as in a bad thing. I'm curious. I'm just curious in lots of different things. So one week I'll write about Bitcoin. The next week I'm writing about Aramco. And the week after that, we're talking about Tesla. Very different structures and companies. And I'm often going into spaces where I know nothing. I know nothing about the internal politics of Saudi Arabia. It's almost impossible to value Aramco without having a political point of view on Saudi Arabia. The two are interlocked. I knew nothing about ride sharing when I sat down to value Uber. I learned my first ride share was actually after I decided to value Uber. I called a car from NYU because I wanted to see what this ride sharing was all about. Now, when I first valued Beyond Meat, I had no idea what this thing was that was supposedly. I went to the grocery store and bought a Beyond Meat frozen. I think it was taco meat. I wanted to see how do you take pea protein and make it taste like meat? I mean, none of this would qualify as research at an investment bank, right? Because we have S&P Capital like you download. And I think that's the problem. We've become so used to thinking of research as numbers you download into big spreadsheets that you all compute all kinds of analytics on, that we forget that the biggest part of learning comes from talking to people who actually use the product, who are actually the customers, the suppliers, the employees. And I think for me, that's where I'm glad you brought up Zomato, because one of the things that's a cultural thing, because you can explain the difference between how much the Chinese spend on food delivery and the US, partly by GDP, which is, let's face it, if you're living on poverty wages, you're not using food service from a restaurant. So part of this is GDP being low. Part of it is smartphone penetration, which is, hey, you need a smartphone to use this. So if you have only 51% penetration versus 90. But there's a third factor, which is more difficult, but just as important, which is there's a cultural component. Now, I think in my post, I talked about my grandmother when I grew up in Chennai, and the fact that she'd never gone to a restaurant in India in her life. It's not because she couldn't afford to, but her view is, why would I ever go to a restaurant to eat food when I have a cook in my house and I can tell the cook exactly what to make and how to make it? It's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
I know that. Now, if she were around, she's not using Zomato to order food ever. It's nothing to do with Zomato. It's just that, that's it. Yeah. So I think culturally, things are changing in India. My nieces and nephews are more willing, but there is still, the Chinese have always ordered out. I've talked to Chinese people, even when they were poor, they used to eat out far more than Indians did. That is not easily quantifiable, but that's, investing in Zomato is a joint bet on Zomato and Indian food eating habits. And might as well be honest about it and open about it. Say, that's part of my story. And I'm going to track that part of my story just as importantly as all the numbers that come out of Zomato.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I'll say one more thing about my conversation with Phil, and we can take the rest of it offline, which is going to be a long conversation. But what fascinated me equally about his latest work with a gentleman called Ezra Karga, who works for the Chicago Fed, is that they've tried this method called reciprocal scoring, where every super forecaster tries to predict what the other one will predict, right? So it's sort of an interesting mechanism where you're incentivized to predict what you think the truth is, or what you think the right value should be, but you're putting yourself in the place of people who are sort of like you and expending a lot of effort to try and get the right answer, right?
It's interesting you bring that up, because have you heard of Trafalgar polls? Pollsters obviously have had a very rough decade since 2016. Trafalgar polling is this outfit that's been around only a few years. The way they poll is, instead of asking you who you plan to vote for, they ask you who you think your neighbors are planning to vote for. They've discovered they get better poll results by asking people that question than asking them the question of who do you want, because they discovered all these poll results were getting skewed. They were getting skewed because people were giving the answer you expected them to give you, because they said, I can't say that because it's not viewed as acceptable. I'm going to say the other guy. So I think it's interesting, because I think we need to rethink how we collect data, how we think about it. And I would be fascinated to see how that plays out in terms of forecast accuracy. Incident, since we're in forecast, there's this hedgehog. Have you read the book about the fox.
Yes, the fox and the hedgehog.
The fox and the hedgehog, which is the other issue, which is I think we've created a world of super specialists. I mean, this morning I had to go on CNBC. And the guy who came before me was a macroeconomist specializing in the Fed. That's his entire life is so focused on what the Fed does that's all he does. Because that's the world we're in. Everybody's a specialist on this tiny, tiny piece of a very big picture. And as he talked, my sense was this guy has absolutely no idea what the big picture looks like. He thinks the entire world is going to either tilt or stay even based on what the Federal Open Market Committee does next week. And the reality is the Fed is a follower. It's not a leader in this process. What happens to interest rates has nothing to do with the Fed raising rates. It's the fact that inflation is out of control and people are terrified of inflation. Interest rates are going to go up with or without the Fed. But that's the problem is we live in a world where we've created specialization that's so deep and so narrow that there are very few big picture people left in the game. People who can, and I call this perspective. Somebody steps back and says, look, what does this mean in the larger scheme of things? And I'll give you one example of how this plays out. If you think Uber is going to win in automated driving, the Kathy Wood story. Let's face it, Kathy's done a good job in calling macro trends. Okay, so that's a plausible story that because they're ahead of everybody else in automated driving, that they're going to be able to get ahead of this and essentially make the ride-sharing business a very different business. Because if you cut the driver out, and then everything is pure profit, right? You don't have to leave 80% on the table. If that story is true, Tesla is going to make money, but there are going to be far fewer cars sold around the world. The reason is simple, right? Right now, 80% of cars, you drive your car to work, it sits in the parking lot, it's incredibly inefficient. If you had automated driving that would drive you to work and then drive back, you probably won't need the 80 million cars you sold last year. You probably could get away with 40 million cars.
Indeed, yeah.
So if you're going to tell me a story about ride-sharing run amok and automated driving taking over, then you can't also tell me a story of Tesla selling 40 million cars out of an 80 million. You can't keep the story going for the number of cars being sold and tell this as a side story.
Yeah. By the way, while we're on this subject, I can't help but ask you, do you have any opinions or views on who you think the winners are going to be in the driverless space at the moment?
I think Uber is going to continue to exist because I don't think any of the companies that make the electric cars want to get their hands dirty by being a ride-sharing company. It's a different business. You're building, different skill sets. And I think that they will... So the 80% that goes to the drivers, in fact, will end up becoming what gets paid to an electric car company if they choose to own the cars. I don't think Uber wants to own the cars. They're not a capital-intensive business. So I think at the end of this, and that's why I'm invested in Uber, because ultimately I think ride-sharing is here to stay. It's not going away anywhere. I noticed that my Uber fares are going up every time I come to New York. The fare, and I hate it as an Uber customer, but as an Uber investor, that I think suggests to me that we're getting closer towards a steady state where ride sharing can actually make more money. Because where are you going to go, right? I mean, it's not like you can say, okay, I'm not going to take Uber or Lyft. We're going to go back to taxi cabs. I'm never getting into a taxi cab again if I have a choice. No, I remember I was in Atlanta about 4 years ago, and I couldn't find an Uber. I couldn't find the place to get the Uber because Atlanta airport had made it so difficult. I ended up taking a yellow cab, and I gave the cab driver the address, and he said, I don't know where it is. And I said, don't you have a GPS that you could put in? And he said, I don't carry a GPS. I had to take my phone, pull up my phone, the map on my phone, put the destination, and give him the smartphone, and he then drove me. And I said, this is absurd. And then you wonder why taxi cabs are losing market share. So I think that in this space, you're going to get there is that networking benefit of people with platforms, with riders who are going to be able to transition into it. I think the automobile companies are going to kind of become one of the beneficiaries if they can find a way to be the people supplying the cars.
Do you think a chip company could actually solve the driverless car problem, like NVIDIA or something, who owns kind of
They
that
will take
stack?
I mean, they might settle for a licensing fee, but the reality is this is going to be a capital intensive business. You're going to keep, and I think the companies that are going to be willing to in this space are the companies that are willing to be capital intensive.
So actually make the car. You're saying the ones who make the car.
Or own the cars, right? So if you don't want the automotive, somebody's got to own the cars, and that's an expensive infrastructure investment. Right? I mean, I think there's a reason why Apple is never going to be in the electric car business because they're spoiled. The reason they're spoiled is they make 45% margins on the smartphone. They make 40% returns on capital. There is no manufacturing business on the face of the earth where you're going to be able to generate that kind of margin and that kind of return on capital. So whenever people say, well, Apple's going to do this, and everything that Apple's done has stayed with a low capital intensity model because it's too easy for them to make money on that model to go out and try to put $100 billion into capital intensive businesses. So I think the technology companies, if they wanted to, could be in the ride sharing space, but I don't think Google or Apple really wants to be in this space because it's not their ball of wax. It's not how they tend to make money.
Yeah. No, I've been very intrigued by NVIDIA and whether they might actually.
I own NVIDIA in my portfolio because I think it's, of all the semiconductor companies, it's the one that thinks of itself not just as somebody supplying a chip for somebody else to do whatever they want, but as somebody who really wants to be part of whatever the metaverse, the global technology universe. And I think that they will find a way to get there. I haven't figured out what it is, but I bought them at a time where I didn't need that to happen for me to get upside. So now if it happens, it's all icing on the cake for me. So, I bought it, 80% of the price increase away before. So it'll stay in my portfolio because it's the kind of investment that I think is going to be a play in whatever technology ends up being.
I sort of feel the same way. I bought it because I thought they were going to be a major player in the AI space because of deep learning and all of that. But that turns out to be only a small part of the reason now that I sort of reconsider, the spaces that they got into.
So they were a big player in the crypto space as well, right? When that was taking off. But you can see these spaces can come and go. Crypto has come and it kind of drops back. So I think that, no.
So talking about crypto and the metaverse and all of that, right? Everyone under 30 asks me about crypto, and I ask them, like, what do you think? And the response I get is, well, it's going to go up. What do you think? Like, are you tempted to buy a plot of land on Sandbox next to Snoop Dogg at all?
No, I think when I think of metaverse, I think of SimCity, right? It's an ages ago phenomenon, right? 30 years ago.
You're dating yourself.
Yeah, I'm dating myself. My kids would come in and say, can I pay this money to buy something on SimCity? And I'd say, not in this real world you live in. But the metaverse is like a SimCity taken and just exploded out to become. So I think the metaverse is kind of a depressing picture of where humanity might be going. If the metaverse is right, you're going to spend your life, maybe that fat guy in Cleveland that Donald Trump talked about, sitting in his armchair, essentially lives his life in the virtual world. He has virtual friends on Facebook. He has a virtual job. He probably takes a virtual car to get there. And after a while, he forgets that line between reality and the virtual world becomes so hazy that you spend money in either. You don't know which world you're in at any point in time. It's a really depressing thought, but it's entirely possible given how much time we spend. We're already in the metaverse, whether we like it or not, right? Now, we don't call it that. So I think from that perspective, it's a recognition of how much time we spend in the virtual world as opposed to the real world as humanity and how that's going to play out. Now, on crypto, I'll be quite honest. I think the biggest problem with crypto are the people who are its biggest promoters, because I take Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin's biggest enemy are the people who are the biggest advocates for Bitcoin, because they've created one of the great speculative instruments of all time, an instrument where you can make 500% in a year or lose 80%. It's something that moves constantly. And a lot of people have become rich on Bitcoin, and a lot of people have become poor on Bitcoin. But if you ask people, why should I buy Bitcoin? You know what? Invariably, the most common answer is, look at how much money I made buying Bitcoin 3 years ago. If Bitcoin is a currency, that's a terrible sales pitch for a currency. I mean, how often do you hold a currency because somebody made 80% return by holding it for the last 3 years? That's not the characteristic of a good currency is stable. A good currency is predictable because it becomes the mechanism that you use to price things. No shopkeeper in his right mind is ever going to price things in Bitcoin because the prices keep moving on you so much during the course of a day. It's like nailing Jello to a wall. If Bitcoin wants to become and that's, I think, the big reason why, if you look at Bitcoin transactions, people actually using Bitcoin to buy and sell things. I know Eric Adams has said, New York's mayor said he's going to get paid in Bitcoin. But if you look at people actually trying to transact on Bitcoin, it's amazing. 13 years after or 14 years after its birth, there are so few actual transactions on Bitcoin that people actually don't use Bitcoin for more transactions. And I think the answer partly is that it's become such a speculative play that it can't be a good currency.
But what about this notion of crypto as the basis just for a whole new way of being, right? Where you don't need intermediaries. I mean, there's something to be said for
Are you talking about are we talking about blockchains now?
Yeah, I'm talking about blockchains. Right? Yeah.
Blockchains, I think, are a technology that clearly has its use where you're going to cut out intermediaries. But remember, blockchain has nothing to do with crypto. You can create blockchains with traditional currencies. I can create blockchains with US dollars. I can deal with Swiss francs. I can deal with Ethereum. So what Bitcoin brought to the world is blockchain. That is here to stay. Well, it'll outlast Bitcoin because there are some transactions, real estate, for instance. If you ever bought a house, you look at it and say, this is the most expensive intermediation I've ever seen. That these guys take 6% of the value of my house for doing what?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I mean, that kind of stuff. Exactly.
So I think blockchain is going to disintermediate many of those very inefficient intermediary processes. And the other advantage of blockchain is you can't mess with the record, right? I mean, if you have physical records in a house, there are cases in countries where people go and forge your name on a document. It happens in India all the time. You think it's your house and somebody shows up, no, this is my house. You can't go back if blockchains are created right and fix the record because it's kind of it's much more difficult. It's not impossible, much more difficult. So there's much to be said for blockchain as an intermediation platform.
So how do you think about it from a valuation or investing perspective? And I'm going to draw an analogy here to Web 2.0, right? I wish I had bought Facebook at $20 and Google at $80 and I was teaching this stuff. I was teaching about digital platforms and all of that stuff, right? And I wish I'd sort of put more of my money where my mouth was earlier on, like in 10, 15 years ago. I find myself asking the same question now. That is, how should I be thinking about who the winners are going to be in this new space? And you must think about this.
And I think that's where I think we need to start to separate crypto into multiple buckets. There are cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin's original aim was cryptocurrency.
Right.
They're crypto assets. I think of Ethereum as more of a crypto asset. It's a lubricant that makes blockchains run more smoothly. Mm-hmm. And if you think of it as crypto commodities, basically it's a commodity that, and if you think about it as a crypto commodity, the price should be driven by demand and supply. Ethereum hasn't quite figured out how to charge for that, but maybe you can think of it as a commodity. And there are crypto assets. Tokens, for instance, and that I think we need to treat the three very separately. I think that crypto commodities and crypto assets clearly have a future, and we have to think about, who are the winners in this space going to be? Which are But cryptocurrencies, I think, have a long way to go because I think I describe Bitcoin as a currency created by the paranoid for the paranoid, right? Because you trust nobody. I mean, and it reflects its history, right? Satoshi Nakamoto, we have no idea whether it was a pseudonym or who it was. November 2008 was when that paper that described Bitcoin came out, November of 2008. I remember November of 2008. It was a scary time. We'd lost faith in everybody, in governments, in central banks, in intermediaries. Bitcoin reflects that lack of trust. It reflects that, and it's very difficult to build an efficient currency without trusting something, without having some trusted entity in the middle. And I think that from that perspective, I think Bitcoin is almost destined to hit a wall because it was never designed to be a widely used currency. But if I were designing a cryptocurrency from scratch, I could probably find a way to do it that gets past this. It'll have to trust some entities. And whether we like it or not, it's got to get some degree of government buy-in. You can't build a currency which you don't get a government buy-in in, because the government still have to collect taxes. They still have to trace some degree of transactions. You can't be an outlaw currency and be a big part of currency markets. So I think that when I look across the space, I'd much rather be investing in something that makes money off crypto than in crypto directly. I'd much rather invest in Coinbase at the right price than buy Bitcoin. So I think that
it's funny. It's funny you say that, because I did get into Coinbase pre-IPO, and I don't own Bitcoin, but I don't feel great about that.
Because you're tied to Bitcoin. For better or worse, Coinbase's revenues are very heavily tied to Bitcoin prices. So
Right.
I don't think they've figured out a way to kind of disconnect themselves, because Bitcoin is such a big part of the game. But I think the platform is what you're looking at and saying, is this a platform that I would go to? Right now, it's not a very efficient platform. I'm not getting great price. So when I want to buy some
it's expensive.
crypto,
Yeah.
it's expensive.
Yeah.
And I've never understood why, if you claim to be the crypto platform, why you aren't offering, better prices. And so I'm not sure where the opacity is coming from and why I'm not seeing lower costs, because that would be my sales pitch for Coinbase, right? We're a crypto platform.
Right.
We're not like these other platforms that do crypto on the side. We are the crypto platform. But they're not giving me any of the benefits of being the crypto specialist. So for me, that's going to be the tipping point. At the point at which I buy Coinbase is when they can show me some evidence of, here, not only are we the crypto platform, here's what we're offering you that makes us cheaper than the other crypto platforms, more reliable than the other crypto platforms.
What about tokens? Is there some basis for thinking about valuation? Because I'm at a complete loss when it comes to
Well, I think of tokens like Disney dollars. Remember, when you go into Disneyland, you can actually go into Magic Kingdom, and that they have that big Main Street, I don't know what they call it, the Main Street building, and you can take $200 of cash and they give you 200 Disney dollars. Those 200 Disney dollars are just like regular dollars as long as you stay in Disneyland. But God help you if you leave and you're not planning to come back, right? I mean, it's not like you can go out and spend the money elsewhere, because nobody else is going to take Disney dollars. The problem with tokens is you've created a currency that works within the entity that creates the token. So as long as you're doing well and people have use for the token, I don't see the benefit of doing that for myself. And why would I want to buy a company-specific currency?
That's a great analogy, by the way. Some people must feel that Ethereum is going to be around forever.
A lot of these people are making bets on their favorite crypto that they think is going to win, which is one reason you can have them all go up, even though collectively maybe only one of them is going to win, right? I call this the big market delusion. You have this story, a macro story about a big market, then every company you look at that approaches, or every item that enters a big market, use the big market argument to justify buying it. There's nothing deeper. This is storytelling at its shallowest. This is part of the reason I don't like what Kathy is doing with companies. It's a storytelling, because when you ask her, why did you buy Spotify? It's like it's a story about streaming music and how everybody's going to be. That's not enough for me. Tell me then why Spotify is going to be the winner in that space, and how it's going to keep away Amazon Music and Apple Music, and you already see the dance that Spotify has to do, because the way you get some niche here is by having a podcast that you can listen to only, and that comes with its whole host of other questions. So I think that by letting people tell macro stories, this is exactly what we're setting ourselves up to, where everything gets pushed up because of the macro story. But eventually, they're going to have one or two winners, and the rest of the stories are going to fall apart.
Right. So a lot of stories, probably a lot of Tharanoses in there
Right.
and similar kinds of.
But I think there's also a cultural phenomenon going on here, which is a lot of people who are in these markets are young, 25. I'm not saying it's tilted young. A lot of them are disillusioned. I mean, now they're disillusioned that they have these if you're a US 30-year-old, you're disillusioned with the college loans they saddled you with. You're convinced, whether fairly or not, that hedge funds have been making a lot of money and that they've come at your expense, that your future doesn't look as bright as your parents' future looked like. So whether fair or not, there's an entire generation of young people who've lost faith in the system, they're disillusioned. And they've decided that cryptos and NFTs, they don't trust stocks, they don't trust bonds, they don't trust the status quo investments. So it's like, in the 1960s, you wanted to fight back, you put a bandana on, you became a hippie, you dropped out, and you moved to Canada. Now, you want to drop out, you move into your basement, you get a powerful computer, and you trade cryptos. No, it's become, and I think it's a reflection. And when you saw this play out, when you saw that GameStop meme, the meme stocks are very much part of that, which is what's driving the price up is not fundamentals, it's not even mood or momentum, it's revenge.
So talking about this, by the way, this whole Robin Hood phenomenon, do you think it's like leading to a distortion in the equity premium?
Yeah. I think or at least in segments of the market, right? I mean, it's notice that the stocks that are picked are AMC, GameStop. I mean, I think about what they share in common, and I could go down the list. If you are in your late 20s or early 30s, and you think about what you grew up with, you probably went to the mall 15, 20 years ago. GameStop store was like a fixture in every mall. Not only did you go in, you played games and you borrowed games. And same thing, you went to the movie. So basically, you take the things that you thought were your institutional entities of the time, and they've now fallen on hard times. Right, with GameStop, it's part of the brick and mortar retail collapse in the U.S. That Amazon's eaten their lunch. Part of this is almost like we're going to reclaim our legacy. Their legacy has become, we want to make the world safe for that GameStop store in the mall to be there. So I think there's a lot of different emotional things driving it. And whenever you have big emotional things driving your trading, you are going to get distortions in those parts of the market. Am I going to try to protect these people from their own mistakes? I don't think I can do that.
What would you advise them?
Well, if they listen to advice, my point is, first, don't let your entire decision process be driven by a false data point. Hedge funds have not beaten the market over the last decade because the presumption here is those hedge fund guys must have made tons of money. You look at the hedge fund alphas over the last decade, they're negative. Hedge funds look a lot like traditional mutual funds. They underperform index funds and ETFs. So that starting premise of, hey, they're all ripping me off and there are these smart guys on Wall Street who get together in a room and decide how to make money and the rest of us are losing money is partly what's driving this process. Is get the facts straight. There's no smart money. There's stupid money and really stupid money. To me, I divide money into arrogant money and humble money. Master Son, ultimate arrogant money, right? Anybody who makes a 300-year plan, I mean, you've left the field. You've risen to a level of arrogance that you think you're godlike. Now I tell people I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when Adam Newman and Master Son were having their conversations. one arrogant man and another arrogant man plotting out how the real estate business was going to be changed. So I think that a lot of this is built on what people believe to be true, which is there's a small subset of people who become rich. And of course, you can offer anecdotal evidence. The rest of us have become poorer. We need to get our revenge on the biggest winner in the GameStop saga was actually a hedge fund. A hedge fund that happened to be on the other side of the transaction. So there's all kinds of irony here that you're taking revenge on the hedge funds and making a one. But I think that my advice to them is less is more. Don't try to get rich in a hurry. Investing is about preserving and growing wealth. It's not about getting rich in a hurry. But I'm afraid that most of them have learned otherwise simply because they've had these limited experience. Look how much money I made last year. Yeah. Look at how much I made in 3 days. That's more than I make in an entire year as income. And you can't go against that anecdotal evidence kind of getting embedded in their minds. They might have lost all that money since, but they still hold on to, look at how much money I made over 3 days. No.
Yeah. No, great advice. Before we wrap up, a couple of quick things. So everyone's talking about inflation these days, right? And they've been wrong for the last 10 years. Do you think they're right this time? Does this seem real or does this seem transitory?
I think for the last 10 years, they were wrong because you never had inflation surges. So they were talking about why deficit spending will create inflation, why QE would create inflation. But this time feels different. I'll tell you what, I went into my local taco shop in La Jolla. And the prices of tacos and burritos there, I've been going there for 10 years, has pretty much been stuck at the same price. So it's like $7.95 for a California burrito. Incredible bargain. I remember about a year ago, I walked in and the price was $11.95. It wasn't just an increase, it was a quantum leap. And I don't know whether you've been noticing this, but I've been noticing that this is something usually when you have inflation coming from something unique, oil prices going up, you see it at the pump, but you're not seeing it everywhere. You're seeing, I think, and that's what I think is scary about this one, is this one feels like it's deeper and wider than the inflation we've seen anytime over the last 40 years. It's not just food, it's not just oil, it seems to be in pretty much, Amazon did increase its Prime membership by another $20, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think that it is true that some companies are being opportunistic because if you've been putting off price increases, this is a perfect time to jump in and say it's inflation, right? Mm-hmm. So I think some of this is almost self-fulfilling, which is, companies are going to use this as an opportunity to catch up on costs that have gone up. But some of this is coming from, the pressure is truly building up from the bottom. I don't think that taco guy can really sell me a California burrito for $7.95 anymore. He's facing not just higher costs for food, but higher costs for every aspect of his business. I talked to him. He said, everything I do costs me more. Now, he didn't give me the actual exact books to look at, but I believe him, And I think that's part of the reason I think we should have been, I think that with inflation, as long it's a genie in the bottle, as long as it stays in the bottle, it's kind of harmless. You let it out of the bottle, and this has always been the history of inflation. Getting it back in is such a lot of work. Remember how much. Now I'm old enough to remember. I started in markets in 1979. I'm old enough to remember what Paul Volcker had to do to break inflation's back. He had to put us into a really deep recession. One or two things is going to happen this year. Either inflation is going to stay high and interest rates are going to go up because you can't have interest rates at 2%, inflation at 5%, or we're going to go into an economic deep freeze. In which case, inflation will take care of itself. Demand will drop off. Economy is in a recession. Neither is a particularly good outcome. I'd rather have probably if you made me pick, it's like picking poisons. I'd rather pick a higher interest rate world where things happen slowly than a deep recession. But I don't see an easy way back to steady state, which I think is what's worrying people, not just economic forecasters, but everybody across the board, consumer confidence, investors. And the strange thing is stock prices have actually been remarkably resilient in spite of these fears. But I think part of the reason for that is we've been spent almost a decade where the rule is if things go down, they always go back up. Right? If you view that, there's no risk in investing, right? Everything always goes back up.
Yeah.
But I'm old enough to remember when things go down and they stay down, right? And a lot of people in markets don't remember that happening. And that's a little scary because if you don't remember that happening, you're going to be casual about risk and risk taking.
And it hasn't happened to most people.
It's happened. I mean, we've become incredibly sloppy in our risk taking, right? From venture capitalists all the way down to private equity investors to those retail, everybody's become sloppy. And I think we might be getting a wake up call of, hey, you know what? Risk is not this abstract concept or a statistical measure. It's that feeling in the pit of your stomach as you watch your entire wealth melting down 5% of the time, and there's not a thing you can do about it.
So what do you see as, given this backdrop, how should people think about investing their money now?
Spread your bets. I mean, diversification has become, now people started to view diversification as this thing that old-fashioned people used to do. I say spread your bets across financial assets, across real assets. And one of the problems we face is the biggest real asset is real estate. And historically, I've said, increase your exposure to real estate.
Historically, you've said that's a good hedge against inflation, right?
And if you want to win on inflation, I know gold is viewed as this thing only your grandparents own. But there's a reason gold has had the staying power for thousands of years. If you lose faith in currencies, gold has been the only asset class that actually benefits from inflation, right? So I think that you want real assets, you want gold, but with one qualifier. Wall Street might have screwed up the real estate asset class for the long term by something that they started doing 40 years ago. I tell people in the 1970s, to invest in real estate, you actually had to buy a house or buy an apartment. You couldn't buy a small piece of a house. You could buy a timeshare, I guess. No. But then in 1981, Lou Ranieri created the mortgage-backed security market, and we were off to the races. We securitized real estate like that was going out of style. You know what? Since the mid-90s, real estate has started to behave like a financial asset class. Stocks go up. Think of 2008. Mm-hmm. The year terrible things happened to your stocks and your bonds, and your real estate also dropped. Your house dropped in price by 30% as well. I hope it's not a long-term problem. But we're going to find out. If inflation stays high, we're going to find out how much damage we've done to real estate as an inflation hedge because we've securitized so much of real estate.
Aswath, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. Really enjoyed it. And I'm going to definitely follow up on that other thread that we explored here, namely trying to get people to become better at or more accurate in forecasting in this space. I think that would be fascinating.
Become Renaissance people is what I tell them, right? I mean, there's a reason why there's people who are engineers, scientists. I mean, if you look at the classic Renaissance man, it's all men because women were not allowed to achieve that status. The Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci, he was a scientist, he was an artist, he was a visionary. And somewhere along the way, we decided that was not efficient, and we went the specialization route, which is, I guess, fine. But I think there's a consequence to that route, and I think we're facing it now. We have too many specialists, too few generalists. And I think, get spread out, have more interests, do more things.
Indeed. Well, thanks for that, Aswath. A pleasure as always.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Take care.